Hello. Today I'd like to talk about something I'm entitling, Do You U.S. Psychiatrists and Social Workers Have a Dirty Secret? And I mention U.S. psychiatry and U.S. social workers for a particular reason, because in many other countries I've come to realize that they don't have the same viewpoint on just how strong an impact the idea of biochemical or genetic issues is when it comes to emotional suffering compared to the U.S. So I'm focusing here on the U.S. approach to dealing with emotional suffering from a scholarly, scientific, educated point of view, say, as taught in colleges today in the U.S. So at any rate, what I would mention, I believe a possible dirty little secret is, when dealing with emotional suffering addressed by psychiatry, say, today, is an overly strong emphasis on the biochemical or genetic factors involved in trauma, or emotional suffering rather, such that, and here's the kicker then, such that most emotional suffering today does not get addressed in a court of law, but instead is, quote, medicated away, and in fact rarely addressed these days with any kind of therapy extending more than a few sessions. And if therapy received on a long-term basis, it being basically to ensure the person stays on their, quote, meds. So I'd like to take a look from my perspective why there's a issue here regarding pursuing causes of emotional suffering in courts, why this rarely happens. And before I launch in, I would also mention that a couple years ago I read something from a psychiatrist in Texas who mentioned that he has noticed, he's in his 70s now, by the way, he's noticed that very few people these days are diagnosed with PTSD. In other words, unless they've come from a battlefield recently, soldiers in particular, that otherwise, he said, people rarely get diagnosed with PTSD, but instead, the number of cases of people diagnosed with the idea of bipolar disorder is going through the roof. I don't have specific numbers, but everybody would say a different number, but there seems to be a disconnect here, he's saying, and I would agree from personal experience, having seen some people around me diagnosed here and there. So, again, why would diagnosis of PTSD be given so infrequently unless they've come from a battlefield? My contention is this, that the dirty secret is perhaps that psychiatrists don't want to spend a significant part of their time in court suing for justice, let's say, against victims, real victims of things like child abuse, spousal abuse, including even marital rape cases, and abuses in society too. Sometimes even abuses by bosses, something seemingly mundane. So at any rate, why would psychiatrists want to spend so little time in court? I suppose the dirty little secret part too is that they would get themselves bloodied. Mostly I think in terms of emotional bloodying. Their self-esteem, their view as going to bat for their clients or patients, if you will, would be pummeled right and left. Pummeled by the best help the abuser could hire. In fact, some people have hired such good help, arguably O.J. Simpson, that many say he got off with a crime that he did commit because he bought the best lawyer in the country and pummeled or bloodied the opposition. So at any rate, what psychiatrist would want to go to court 3 or 4 times a week and get themselves emotionally bloodied, their competency questioned, their views questioned, their motives questioned on a routine basis, and then have to come home at night to their wives and children and be civil, loving, and supportive? And that would never happen, I believe. They would be a basket case within 2 months of these court appearances all the time. Of course, tranquilizers and alcohol use, cocaine, marijuana, all would enter in as coping mechanisms too. Following, they're going to see a psychiatrist very soon themselves for aid, for, quote, medications, and next thing you know, they'd be in a psych hospital or jumping out a window themselves. So, of course, this is compounded by how few psychiatrists also have a law degree to even have much sense of how to fight an argument in court. And what client of theirs has the money to hire a good lawyer anyway? If they had that kind of money, they would probably not have been so abused or been able to get out of that situation in the first place. So it's just a big mess all around, I think. Now, why is there such opposition in court, let's say, if matters had to go to that level? To seek financial remuneration for one thing, and some recovery of self-esteem for the victims. My personal opinion is that our U.S. justice system hands out routinely punishments that are so draconian in comparison to the crimes committed that nobody in his right mind would want to end up in prison, a U.S. prison. Arguably horribly overcrowded, full of tremendously violent people, you might say a number of axe murderers almost, and I'd hate to even wonder who Martha Stewart's roommate was when she was in prison for a financial conviction. Maybe her roommate was an axe murderer, so to speak. So, anyone committing any crime in prison and spending prison time is not going to be a happy camper. We're not even talking pressure to join gangs, murders there, getting beaten up, and so on. And of course, shall we say politely, sexual abuse in prison under full cognizance of the guards. For instance, I read once that one guard in a prison said that the guards tend to allow rapes to happen to keep down the prison population, to keep it from being a country club where the homeless would go to in the wintertime because it's warmer there, and you don't get kicked out of the homeless shelter in the daytime to go out on the cold streets. And furthermore, look at the length of the sentencing too, and of course what happens to you when you get out and you're called an ex-con, and good luck finding a job outside of the trucking industry or construction. You'd be lucky to get a job bagging groceries, or God forbid trying to find even a job as a dog catcher in some town. So, of course, finding a decent spouse too is probably out of the question, unless you go to some group meeting and meet another so-called ex-con and marry him or her. At any rate, it's a very prickly situation. Case in point, a man of 20, Michael Santos, was convicted of selling cocaine and spent the next 27 years in prison. Now, interestingly, he studied Plato and other subjects, philosophy, maybe spirituality while in there, and really came out the other end and made $1 million or more within the first 2 years of exiting, wrote books in prison, and I believe even got married while in prison. But that's 1 in a million. 1 in a million. And again, he spent 27 years there in the most horrible prisons in the country, too. So what person committing child abuse or spousal abuse, even you might call boss abuse, is going to want to spend time in prison if it's not going to be a 90-day sentence with no stigma afterward? We're talking 5, 10 years, maybe 20, 30 years. They're going to be a basket case when they come out and be on medications for the rest of their lives and on disability, in terrible housing, subsidized at best. Probably half of them will commit suicide by overdose. So, with all of this considered, anyone charged with anything related to abuse is not going to be a happy camper, will hire the best lawyer in town, go after the juggler of the person accusing them, the lawyers defending that person, and every psychiatrist in court defending the victim too. That, in my view, then is the crux of the whole possible dirty secret I'm talking about. A combination of the stress on psychiatrists, if testifying, combined with the draconian sentences and prison system itself in America that makes fighting abuse charges a matter of life and death, really. And of course, then the psychiatrists are on the receiving end of those people being abusers, wanting to preserve their very lives, in fact, not getting just a tiny little slap on the wrist. So I'll give you 2 examples I know of from people I've personally known. First, a young woman who was living at the time with her mother and her stepfather for certain reasons, including certain educational deficiencies, her having been an immigrant. So she was living with her parents, her father, a stepfather, and the ugly little situation was that, while I knew her, he was molesting her weekly. When she was in her 20s, and she would have loved to have left, but she didn't have the resources, and you could say the options were not pretty. Homeless shelters would have been worse, and arguably battered women's shelters too. And of course, who knows offhand which ones are the best and which ones are the worst? You're asking a person to jump from one frying pan to a worse frying pan. So she stuck it through there for many years, and at one point in time, I was talking with her stepfather, and he confided in me and said, how can I live with someone so mentally ill? In other words, as my stepdaughter. Because she used to stick up for herself so much, and that she was a thorn in his side. So he considered her, quote, mentally ill, and she was packed off, of course, and encouraged for therapy and everything, and drug treatment, and of course she wanted seeking assistance anyway, and the upshot is, he never spent a day in therapy, never received any diagnoses, never took any, quote, medications, perhaps except whiskey, and yes, he had an alcohol addiction problem at an earlier point in time. Now, if some therapist had said, or her psychiatrist, I think we should take this to court, given you having no options other than this, especially. Well, don't you think he would have hired the best lawyer he could and eviscerated any psychiatrist who attempted to defend her? Well, you bet you, because he would have spent the next 30 years in prison and been a little buddy to somebody, let's say, alongside while in prison. Hence the phrase, don't drop the soap while you're taking a shower in prison. Well, knowing all that, he pinned everything on her, and of course what psychiatrist then is going to go to bat for her? She then received the diagnosis of bipolar disorder and was heavily drugged. And furthermore, is left wondering how much of a so-called biochemical disordered issue she has compared to it being mainly her stepfather's issue and her lack of alternatives to get out of the situation. Now we can debate till the cows come home whether she had a predisposition of some sort causing her distress emotionally, but you tell me who is not going to have some kind of distress if they're being molested weekly and can't leave and have no education. And now case number 2. I once knew a woman, too, who at one point in time had weighed 500 pounds. And she was presently down to 120 pounds after having secured the services of a really great therapist who helped her work through a lot of abuse issues. At the present time, I knew her when she was down to 120 pounds. She was living with some relatives and extended relatives, having to do a lot of caretaking and suffering a lot of emotional abuse. She simply couldn't get out of that situation. The options were worse than what she was in. She was so much mature in time than those in the situation she was in, but guess what? The solution psychiatry came up with to get her out of that situation before she jumped out a window, say, is to put her in a group home. In other words, not to take anyone to court as a last alternative, but to simply not go to court, not get bloodied up, so to speak, and ship her off to a group home, saying, in essence, that she was basically incompetent to even take care of her daily needs. So the first case I brought up, the person was deemed bipolar and medicated to the hilt, and their self-esteem destroyed. And the second case, the person was basically deemed and stated to be incompetent and shipped to a group home, a nursing home. Yes, a nursing home, instead of, again, someone going to bat for them in court. Now, this is no big indictment on my part towards some kind of moral weakness or failing in psychiatrists or anyone else. In fact, I think anyone who would go to court for anyone else's benefit, for low pay too, more than a few times, and then start to suffer emotionally themselves and put their family in danger even then from their being unsupportive to the hilt in the future, would arguably be cuckoo and need some kind of treatment for being so altruistic, in a sense, not taking care of their own needs at all. I just don't see an easy solution to this, especially as long as our prison sentences are so draconian and the prison cells themselves, the whole apparatus. And so I offer very little in the way of solutions except to urge us all to take a closer examination of what's a bit of a sticky issue, a little frightening actually, and more than a bit of a sticky issue here. I think the solution starts with taking blinders off and looking at the uncomfortable and asking a lot of questions of all kinds of people in the hopes that say our prison sentences would change so that those people taken to court would know beforehand that if they were convicted, they would basically not be murdered there in prison, at least emotionally, coming out a basket case at best. So, once again, I offer no solutions, but that maybe we try to face more of the uncomfortable about what's going on in our lives in general, in the hope that more questions get asked and a little more discussion all the time about very difficult issues in our society in particular. I wish you a good day.